My father
Let's
poured
review these
31
structural
years
changes.
of sweat and
The load-bearing
silence into a
walls need
company that
adjustment.
carried our family
The
name
skyline
on
is a
every
reminder
job
of what's
site
at
in Atlanta.
stake.
And his
I'll mark the
wife started
revisions.
photographing his private files 8 months before he was even in the ground. I gave those greedy heirs exactly what they were after. And when their lawyer read one sentence out loud in that courtroom, he stopped, took his glasses off, turned and looked at Brianna like a man who had just stepped into a room he didn't know was a trap. But I'll get to that. My name is Zora Bennett, 38 years old, construction engineer out of Atlanta. I build things for a living: roads, foundations, structures meant to carry weight through every kind of storm. And for most of my life, I believed that if you laid a solid enough foundation, whatever stood on top of it would hold. I was right. I just didn't know yet how far back my father had already started digging. March 2024. I was holding his hand when he left. Quentin Freeman, 6'2", broad shoulders, silver hair kept close, a small scar above his left brow from a job site accident in '98. Heart attack. Fast, the doctor said. I choose to believe that. His last words were barely a whisper, his hand wrapped around mine, large and warm even then. We don't just build houses, baby girl. We build futures for the ones coming after us. I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. The house on Andrews Drive still smelled like him. Camphor, old flannel, pine cleaner. Even at the end, the shirts were folded, the project notebooks stacked, the driveway swept. My father kept things in order, always had. The funeral was 2 days later. Cascade Road Baptist. Pews packed. Foremen, subcontractors, neighbors from Collier Heights where Dad first hung the Freeman General Contractor sign 30 years ago. Someone left a peach cobbler on the back step without knocking. That's what his name meant in this city. Something real, something earned. Brianna stood near the casket in a black blouse and heels, accepting condolences with the composure of someone who had rehearsed it. Warm smile, carefully arranged expression, eyes that stayed just a little too still behind the warmth. My kids, Jamal, 12, and Nia, 9, sat beside me in the front pew. He'd taught Jamal how to read a level, let Nia ride in the cab of the old pickup on Saturday mornings. Brianna had always treated them like polite house guests, welcome to visit, not welcome to stay. I noticed things like that, filed them away. Engineers do that. We look for where the stress is going to crack. 48 hours after we buried him, the email came. Gerald Holt, 14 lines. Brianna Lawson Freeman was filing to claim full ownership of Freeman General Contractors. Every contract, every piece of equipment, every dollar my father had built across 31 years. Gerald cited a prenuptial amendment and an updated will, both allegedly signed in the final 18 months of Dad's life. He wrote like a man who expected this wrapped up before the week was out. I read it 3 times, poured out the cold coffee, made a fresh pot. Then I went to pack up my father's things, and tucked between 2 flannel shirts in his dresser drawer, I found a handwritten note. Old paper, his handwriting. A message to his attorney, Kevin Marsh. If something happens to me, protect the company for Zora and the grandchildren. Don't let Brianna know. My hands were shaking before I finished the first line. I didn't know yet what my father had built in secret. I didn't know yet what was already waiting. But right then, standing in his bedroom with that note in my hands, I understood one thing clearly. He had seen this coming, long before any of us. Stay with me, because what my father left behind will change the way you think about what a family is truly worth protecting. Grief doesn't arrive clean. It catches you mid-motion. Rinsing a coffee cup, signing a permission slip, standing in a doorway you're not ready to walk through yet. I held it together for Jamal and Nia. That was the only decision I made in those first 48 hours, and I held to it hard. Jamal went quiet the way he always does when something is too big, absorbing everything, saying almost nothing. Nia stayed within arm's reach. Grocery store, church parking lot, back porch after dinner. 9 years old and already sensing that something in the weight of our lives had shifted in a way it wouldn't shift back from. Brianna played her part well. She handled the flower arrangements, sent a handwritten note to Dad's oldest foreman. Then, on the third day after Gerald's email, before I'd responded to him at all, she texted me. "Let's handle this like adults. The children need the family to stay together." Warm, measured, reasonable. But I'm an engineer. I look underneath things. I checked the email metadata. Nothing sophisticated, just the routing header. What I found made me set the phone down on the kitchen counter slowly, the way you set something down when you don't trust your own hands. Brianna had first contacted Gerald Holt's firm 2 weeks before my father passed. 2 weeks. The chain she'd forwarded to a peer cooperative included a prior thread she'd apparently forgotten was attached. In that thread, company operating accounts, equipment titles, receivable schedule, and one line that stopped my breath cold. Children's Trust Disbursement Structure. She'd known about the kids' accounts. She'd been cataloging them. Before my father died, the warm texts, the composed grief at the funeral, the reasonable talk about family, none of it was what it looked like. Brianna had been performing the grieving widow while running something else entirely underneath it. And the worst part wasn't the calculation itself. It was how long it had been running. Betrayal born of planning is a different thing altogether from betrayal born of desperation. One you can almost understand. The other just sits cold in your chest. I called
The
Kevin
projections
Marsh the
here
next
are
morning.
optimistic.
What
Kevin
about
had
the
been
risk
Dad's business
assessment?
attorney for
It's
over
all
a decade.
covered in this section.
Quiet man,
I see. That
wire-rimmed
looks solid.
glasses.
Good.
He
Let's
chose his
proceed.
words the way a good carpenter chooses a joint, for fit, not show. When I got to his office on Peachtree Street, he was already waiting, and he didn't waste either of our time. He told me about the Freeman Family Trust. 18 months before his death, my father had asked Kevin to structure something careful and specific. Every real operating asset of the business, the active contracts, the bonded work, the equipment titles, the intellectual property, all of it transferred into a family trust. My name as sole trustee. Jamal and Nia as primary beneficiaries. Executed cleanly, quietly, completely outside the LLC that still carried the company name. What remained inside that LLC, the entity Gerald was fighting to hand Brianna, was structurally intact and operationally empty. Kevin said it straight. Current operating asset value, 0. My father had seen it coming long before I did, and he had built accordingly. That same week, I got a text from Brianna. She wanted to meet at Piedmont Park, said she needed air, said she just wanted to talk, woman to woman, outside of lawyers and formalities. I went. I didn't know yet what she'd show me by going. She cried, genuinely, it seemed, or close enough that I couldn't tell the difference from where I was sitting on that bench. She talked about how hard it had been, how much she had loved my father, how she wasn't trying to take anything from me or the children. She just wanted what was fair. I listened. I said very little, and I drove home thinking about the metadata. That evening, Doug Henderson found me on the Midtown job site. Doug had worked for Dad since the early 90s. Wiry, gray-mustached, the kind of man who moves slow on purpose because he's learned that slow is usually right. He pulled me aside near the foundation forms, back to the trailer, voice low. About 2 months before Mr. Freeman passed, I came in early one morning and caught Mrs. Brianna in the accounting office, going through the financial binders. I told your father the next morning. He thanked me, went quiet. I could tell he already knew. My father hadn't just anticipated what was coming. He had watched it arrive in real time, and still chose patience over reaction, still chose the plan over the feeling. That kind of discipline, in the face of that kind of thing, is not something I have a clean word for. 3 days after that, Jamal got off the school bus quieter than usual, set a small manila envelope on the kitchen table next to my blueprints, stood there with his hands in his pockets. Grandpa gave me this before he got really sick. He said to hold it for you. Said you'd know when to open it. A pause. Brianna asked me about it twice. Second time, her voice went different. Cold. I stopped answering her after that. 12 years old. He hadn't fully understood what he was carrying, but some part of him had understood it mattered, and that the woman asking for it made him feel unsafe. He'd trusted that. Held the line without anyone telling him to, without anyone even knowing he was holding it. Inside the envelope, a USB drive. Date-stamped security footage from the hallway camera outside Dad's home office. Brianna at the filing cabinet. Documents spread across the desk. Her phone raised, photographing page after page. Timestamp. 8 months before my father died. She hadn't been grieving, she'd been preparing. I set the USB on the counter, stood there a minute under the kitchen light. Then I went to get my father's project notebook, the worn leather one from the top drawer of his desk. I needed to think in his language. I needed to be close to something that was his. I opened it to the last written page, the final page, the one after his last entry had been torn out. Not ripped, torn clean, the way a man with steady hands removes something on purpose. I stared at that edge for a long time. Then I made my decision. I was going to follow my father's plan all the way to the end, including the part Kevin had explained, the part where I handed Brianna exactly what she thought she wanted. Give her the company shell. But that torn page wouldn't leave me alone. Brianna had been in that office. The footage proved it. But the tear was clean and deliberate, and my father had steady hands and a precise nature, and those two things didn't add up to the same person. Had she taken it? Or had he? Do you think a person who plans this quietly is protecting their family? Or are they just as calculated as the person they're guarding against? Because that question is exactly what the next part of this story forces you to answer. Fulton County Courthouse, Pryor Street, downtown Atlanta. Gray stone, the kind of building that has held more human grief and hope than most people are comfortable calculating. Morning of the first hearing, dark blazer, simple blouse, low heels. The small gold stud earrings my father gave me the day I graduated from Georgia Tech. Nothing else. I wanted to look like exactly what I was, a working woman, a daughter, an engineer, not someone who could be dismissed at a glance. I had barely slept, not from fear exactly, but from that specific kind of wakefulness where your mind won't stop running load calculations on every possible outcome. I'd been lying in the dark at 2 a.m, rehearsing contingencies the way I rehearse site plans, accounting for what could go wrong, where the pressure points were, what the failure modes looked like. By the time my alarm went off, I'd already been staring at the ceiling for an hour. Kevin met me in the lobby. 3 words before we walked in: trust the plan. I said, I trust my father. We walked in. Gerald was already at the plaintiff's table, arranged with the easy confidence of a man who considers the result a formality he's graciously allowing the court to process. Charcoal suit, junior associate carrying his files, he spoke to the clerk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who files motions in this building regularly. Brianna sat beside him, hands folded, wearing a navy blouse that managed to be simultaneously understated and carefully chosen. Her expression was composed, settled. The expression of a woman who had decided the outcome before she walked through the door. I sat across the aisle with Kevin. We did not look at each other again after we sat down. Gerald presented his case methodically and with precision. The prenuptial amendment, the updated will, signed, he said, by Quentin Freeman in August of 2023. His central argument: the Freeman Family Trust had been established under conditions of undue influence, at a point when my father's health was already in decline, as a last-minute maneuver to strip a spouse of 14 years of her rightful legal standing. He cited Georgia probate statutes. He cited case precedent. He was thorough, and he was confident, and he spoke with the fluency of someone who had prepared extensively and knew it. He was also careful, I noticed, not to hold my gaze for more than a second at a time. The judge, silver-framed glasses, the particular stillness of someone who has genuinely heard everything, listened without interrupting, made her notes, asked Gerald 2 clarifying questions about the will's amendment timeline. He answered smoothly, almost too smoothly, the kind of smooth that only comes when you've rehearsed the questions because you anticipated them. Then Gerald filed a motion to have the trust declared procedurally defective, too recently created, too conveniently timed, too obviously designed to cut out a spouse with established legal standing. He asked the court to invalidate the trust's protective provisions pending a full evidentiary hearing. The judge said the court would recess to review the documentation, then hear from respondent's counsel upon return. In the hallway, Kevin and I stood near a window overlooking Pryor Street. Below us, Atlanta moved the way it always does, busy, purposeful, indifferent to whatever was happening 6 floors up. I pressed my palm flat against the window glass. It was cool, grounding. I needed something to press against. When we go back in, Kevin said, I need you to sign the LLC transfer. Fully executed, no conditions, unconditional transfer to the claimant. You understand what you're handing over? I said, an empty box. He said, an empty box. My hands were not entirely steady when I signed. I want to be honest about that because it matters. 18 years of watching my father build Freeman General Contractors, 18 years of job sites and early mornings and project boards and bids that kept the crew employed through lean seasons, and I was sitting in a courthouse hallway, signing the name over to a woman who had photographed his files in the dark while he was still alive. There is no clean way to do that. No detachment that makes it not feel like something. But I signed, because my father had measured twice, and now it was time to cut. When we returned to the courtroom, Kevin informed the judge that the respondent was prepared to execute a full, unconditional transfer of the LLC to the claimant, effective immediately, on the record, with no conditions attached. Gerald Holt blinked. One single, involuntary blink. He recovered quickly, leaned over to Brianna, said something brief and quiet. She gave a small, controlled nod. The kind of nod a person gives when they'd just been told they won. I watched her shoulders settle slightly, the barely perceptible release of tension in someone who had been holding their breath without realizing it. The transfer was accepted on the record. Gerald stood. Gracious. Sensible resolution. Spirit of good faith. He gave me one brief glance across the courtroom, the kind that communicates without a single word. We both know how this ended. Then Kevin asked the judge's permission to enter the LLC's current operating documentation into the record. Standard procedure during any transfer. A formality, he said. The judge granted it without comment. Kevin produced a single sheet of paper and handed a courtesy copy across to Gerald. Gerald took it, glanced at it. His eyes moved across the page at the casual pace of a man skimming something he fully expects to be routine, and then they stopped. I watched him read the same line 3 times. I counted, because that is how I am built, because accuracy is the habit of someone who builds things for a living. 3 times. He cleared his throat, looked up at Kevin, looked back down at the page, set the page down, picked it up again. And then, almost involuntarily, the way your eyes go to a sound before your brain decides to turn, he looked at Brianna. She was watching him with that composed expression, waiting for the confirmation, waiting for the nod that said everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The nod didn't come. Your Honor, Gerald said, in a voice that had lost something, not just confidence, but structure. I would like to request a brief recess to review this documentation. The judge looked at him over the top of her glasses, the look of someone who has seen many lawyers and can tell the difference between a man who needs more time and a man who needs a miracle. We just had a recess, Counselor. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. I believe there may be a discrepancy in the asset valuation summary. The room noticed the pause that followed. Rooms always do. Something in the air pressure changes. Every person in a courtroom, even the ones pretending not to pay attention, becomes very still. The judge said they'd reconvene the following morning. I stood, gathered my jacket, and walked out at a measured pace, steady, unhurried. The way you walk on a job site when something's gone wrong and you need the crew to stay calm. Outside on Pryor Street, the afternoon sun cut hard between the downtown buildings, and Kevin fell into step beside me without speaking until we reached the corner. Then, quietly, it worked. I sat in my car a long time before I started it, pressed my back against the seat, stared at the ceiling of the cab, and thought about a man in a flannel shirt at a drafting table, pencil in hand, drawing plans for something no one else could see yet. What had just happened in that courtroom was not a trick. It was not revenge dressed up as strategy. It was the completion of a structure built by a man who had understood, long before I did, that the most dangerous response to greed is not confrontation. It is patience. Greed is loud and impatient. It moves fast. It reaches before the ground is ready. My father had simply built the consequence into the architecture of Brianna's own ambition and waited for her to walk through the door he'd designed for her. The transfer she was celebrating tonight wasn't her prize. It was the entry point to a room she'd never read the blueprints for. I pressed my hand over the USB in my jacket pocket. Then I drove home to make scrambled eggs for 2 kids who deserved one normal evening. What Gerald Holt read on that page, and what it meant for everything Brianna believed she'd just won, is something no one in that courtroom was prepared for. And it starts with a phone call at 9:47 at night. Kevin called at 9:47. I was at the kitchen table, project file open in front of me, red pen in my hand. Nia was asleep on the couch, one braid loose, sneakers still on her feet, tablet screen still glowing against her cheek. Jamal had gone to bed at 9, but left his light on, the way he does when he can't fully settle. The house was quiet in the way it gets when your kids are in it. Not silent, but held together by something you can feel but can't quite name. "We have a problem," Kevin said. I set the pen down. Gerald filed an overnight subpoena for the original trust formation records. He's going to argue tomorrow that the trust was executed outside the statutory window for required spousal notification under Georgia law. If the judge agrees with his timeline, she could order a stay on the trust's protected provisions while the case goes to a full evidentiary hearing. That process could run 8 months, maybe more. I already knew what I needed to ask, but I made myself breathe first. What happens to the children's accounts during a stay? A pause, the kind that tells you the answer before the words do. Frozen, pending review. I set the phone on the table and stared at the wall. The clock above the stove read 9:49. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car went by slowly, music drifting through the window screen and fading out. Jamal and Nia's names were on those accounts. The college disbursements my father had saved for over a decade. The housing allocation he'd set aside specifically for their futures, written into the trust in his own handwriting. Frozen. Because someone who had been photographing his files 8 months before he died had filed a subpoena at midnight. I picked the phone back up. "What do we do?" Kevin said. "We go in tomorrow with everything. All of it. No more holding back." Morning.
Mr. Johnson,
Same
this
chair,
document shows the
same
transfer.
blazer,
I
both
don't
hands
recall
flat
that.
and still on the
It's your
table in front of
signature.
me.
Are you denying it?
I had driven
No,
past
but
the house
amount
on
is
Andrews
wrong.
Drive on
So
my way
you admit it.
downtown. I don't know exactly why. I hadn't planned to. But I found myself slowing on the street, looking at the porch, the oak tree, the dark blue curtain still visible behind the front window. Then I drove on. Some mornings, you just need to know where you came from before you walk into a room. Gerald opened his morning argument without hesitation. Statutory timeline, Georgia probate code, spousal notification requirements. 3 precedent cases where similar trusts had been stayed pending review. He was composed and precise and still carrying enough confidence from the day before to move like a man who expects to recover what he believes he almost had. Then Kevin stood. He began with the forensic audit. An independent, certified accounting firm had conducted a complete review of Freeman General Contractors LLC financial records over the preceding weeks. The findings: $280,000 transferred from the company's operating accounts to an entity called Lawson Strategic Interiors over a period of 14 months. Coded internally as vendor service payments. No corresponding contracts on file. No documented services rendered. No invoices that matched the transfer amounts. Lawson Strategic Interiors, sole proprietor business, state of Georgia, registered to Brianna Lawson Freeman. I heard a chair shift somewhere behind me. I kept my eyes forward. Kevin called Doug Henderson. Doug walked to the front of the courtroom in a pressed button-down shirt, hat in both hands, standing the way a man stands when he is making sure every word is exactly true and nothing more or less. He stated that approximately 6 months before Quentin Freeman's death, his employer had spoken to him directly, one time, quietly. Never let Mrs. Lawson into the accounting office alone. Doug had followed that instruction every day from that point forward until the day Mr. Freeman passed. Gerald objected twice during Doug's statement. The judge sustained one, overruled the other. Then Kevin addressed the children. He entered into evidence a written communication obtained with the full cooperation of Brianna's former spouse, who had been separately contacted during the investigation. A private message from Brianna's own son to a cousin sent before my father's death. Mom said after she gets the company, we won't have to worry about money anymore. She said she'd been planning it even before the old man got really sick. The room went the kind of quiet that is different from ordinary quiet. The kind where you can feel people processing what they've just heard and not quite finishing the thought. Kevin entered the USB drive into evidence. The courtroom monitor came up. Timestamp in the corner of the frame. The hallway outside the home office on Andrews Drive. A figure moving through the frame. Into the room. Documents arranged on the desk surface. A phone raised. Pages photographed one after another, methodically, without hurry. The date stamped on the footage. 8 months before my father died. I watched Brianna's reflection in the monitor glass, just for a moment. Her expression had changed. Not collapsed, she was too controlled for that. But something behind it had shifted. The composed surface was still in place, but whatever had been holding it up from the inside had quietly given way. No one in that room spoke. Kevin then submitted the full Freeman Family Trust document into the official court record. Standard procedure following the LLC transfer. He asked the court to note in particular Section 7, subsection D. He read it aloud. No theater, no pause for effect. Just plainly, the way my father had written it, every word chosen and weighted on purpose. Any party, individual, or claimant who attempts to challenge, manipulate, coerce, or otherwise circumvent the provisions of this trust for personal financial gain, including through legal action undertaken in bad faith, shall forfeit in their entirety any inheritance rights, claims, or interests connected to the Freeman estate and its associated holdings. Gerald Holt went still. He read the line on the page in front of him. Then he read it again. The associate beside him leaned over and said something in a low voice. Gerald didn't respond. He set the page down on the table, picked up his glasses, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man doing something he cannot walk back. He folded them close between 2 fingers and set them down beside the page. The whole motion took maybe 4 seconds. It felt much longer. He turned to look at Brianna. She looked back at him. For the first time since I'd watched her receive condolences at my father's funeral, her composure wasn't performing. It was just thin. The kind of thin you can see through when the light hits it right. Her expression was asking him a question. He answered it without saying a word. Gerald faced the judge. His voice, when it came, had lost every trace of the morning's architecture. Your Honor, I cannot in good conscience recommend that this claim proceed. The judge didn't react, just looked at him over her reading glasses with the steady patience of a woman who has waited out more dramatic moments than this one. Are you withdrawing the claim, counselor? The pause that followed occupied every molecule of air in that room. Yes, Your Honor. Brianna said, no. One word, the first word she had spoken aloud across 2 full days in that courtroom. Small, sharp. The sound of someone who has just watched the floor go out from under them and hasn't caught up to the falling yet. Gerald did not look at her. The judge made her notes without hurry. The withdrawal entered into the record. The forensic audit findings referred to the appropriate state and financial authorities for independent review. Both counsels thanked. Materials gathered, folder closed. She stood and left the bench. No gavel, no declaration. Just a woman with 3 decades of judgment, closing a matter that had already been decided. Not that morning, not in that building, but by a man in a flannel shirt at a drafting table 18 months earlier, working alone in a house on Andrews Drive while his wife cataloged his assets and his daughter didn't yet know what was coming. I sat still while the room shifted around me, both hands flat on the table. What I understood now, sitting in the quiet of that courtroom, fully, finally, without any reservation, was this. My father hadn't built that trust from fear. He hadn't built it from anger. He'd built it from the same place he built everything else, a deep, steady, forward-looking love that never needed an audience. The most dangerous thing Brianna had underestimated was never the legal structure. It was the man who created it. She'd assumed that because Quentin Freeman was gentle, he was passive. She'd read his quiet as weakness. But the people who really build things, who carry weight in silence for decades, they almost never are what the impatient ones assume. They work on a longer timeline, and slow, in the end, had won. I pressed my hand over the USB in my jacket pocket one last time. Then I walked out into the Atlanta afternoon. What was waiting for me at home? A letter, a torn notebook page, and a question from my 12-year-old that I wasn't ready for, is the part of this story that matters most. And it starts with scrambled eggs. Brianna left the courthouse the way certain people leave hard rooms. Head forward, posture straight, not looking back. There was a discipline in it I almost understood. When everything you planned falls apart in a public room, sometimes the only thing you still own is how you carry yourself walking out the door. The investigation that followed wasn't mine to manage. Kevin kept me informed where it touched the trust and my children's accounts. The rest belonged to the law. I had a company to run, my father's name to carry, 2 kids who needed their mother present and forward-facing, not consumed by what Brianna had tried to do, but grounded in what came next. I was back on the Midtown job site within a week. First morning back, the crew was quiet in that specific way, not uncomfortable, just careful, respectful, without making a production of it. Nobody trying to smooth it over or make it smaller than it was. Doug handed me a hard hat before I could reach for one. I put it on, picked up the project board, and we walked the site the way we always had, starting at the foundation, the way my father had taught me. Marcus, one of the younger guys, barely 22, first real season on a commercial build, caught up to me near the formwork. He said, "Miss Bennett, you good?" Not asking about the case, not asking about the company, just asking about me, the way young people do when they actually mean it and haven't learned yet to dress the question up. I looked at him, said, "Yeah, I'm good." And I was surprised by how much I meant it when it came out. That Friday, I picked up Jamal and Nia in my father's 1989 Ford pickup, the one I'd spent 3 evenings in the driveway repainting, panel by panel, back to the same deep green Dad had kept on it for as long as I could remember. The engine was loud and clean and certain. I had replaced one belt and changed the oil and tightened the passenger door latch that had rattled loose, and otherwise left it exactly as he'd kept it. When I pulled out onto Peachtree Street with both kids buckled in beside me, Jamal ran his hand slowly across the dashboard. Nia pressed her cheek against the window and watched the city go past. Neither of them said anything for a few blocks. Then Nia said, "It smells like Grandpa in here." I didn't answer right away, just drove, my hand steady on the wheel and something tight in the back of my throat. "Yeah," I finally said, "it does." The truck sounded like something alive, like something that hadn't forgotten where it came from and wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. At home, I made scrambled eggs. Low heat, slow hand, more butter than is strictly necessary, exactly the way my father had made them since I was small enough to watch from a step stool. Nia climbed up on the counter to supervise and offered opinions I didn't ask for, and I let her. Jamal set the table without being asked, which in 12 years of raising him had genuinely never happened without some form of negotiation. I didn't comment. Some things deserve to exist without being pointed at. After dinner, Jamal picked up the USB from the counter, turned it in his fingers. "Mom, is everything on here? Everything Grandpa saved?" "A lot of it," I said. "He knew it was coming, didn't he? All of it?" I looked at him. My father's eyes, my father's jaw, that particular quality of stillness he carries in his body, like something he was born understanding, rather than something he was taught. "He saw it," I said. He prepared. Jamal set the drive down on the table with the careful deliberateness you use for things that matter. I want to learn how to do that, he said, to see things before they happen, to think that far ahead. He was already teaching you, I said. You just didn't know it yet. Mia had been quiet through all of this, with the focused attention of a 9-year-old, pretending not to listen while catching every word. She looked up at me. Mom, did Grandpa know we were going to be okay? I crouched down to her level, her braids slightly loose at the ends, looking at me with complete, unguarded trust. The kind children give you before the world teaches them to ration it. That's exactly why he did all of it, I said, to make sure. She nodded once, fully satisfied the way children are when an answer confirms what they already believed in their bones. Then she went back to her food. 2 weeks after the hearing, Kevin brought me a sealed envelope. My father had left it with him 14 months before he died, with a single written instruction. Deliver it to Zora only after all legal proceedings connected to the estate had concluded. Kevin set it on my kitchen table, told me he'd let himself out, and left me alone with it. I read it early on a Saturday morning, before the children were up, coffee going cold at my elbow. Zora, if you're reading this, then you finish what I started. I knew you would. You always could read a foundation before anyone else saw the problem. I didn't build any of this from anger. I built it from love. For you, for Jamal, for Nia, and for 31 years of work that was never just mine to keep. I saw what was coming. I had time, so I used it. The page missing from the notebook, I removed it myself. I filed it in the trust documents. I didn't want it found before the time was right. Some plans only work if the ground is set before anyone looks down. Teach the children. Build with patience. Build with honesty. Build with your mind and your heart together, because one without the other doesn't hold under real pressure. I'm proud of you. I have always been proud of you. I sat with that letter for a long time. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor. The mockingbird in the backyard oak started up before 7 and ran through its entire catalog without stopping. Everything outside was ordinary. Everything was fine. The torn page was never stolen. My father had pulled it himself, filed it exactly where it needed to be, and left the gap as a deliberate question, knowing that when I found it, I'd stay alert, stay sharp, keep moving forward even without every answer in hand. Because that was what the plan required. He'd trusted me to notice the gap. He'd trusted me to keep going anyway. He'd built the uncertainty into the design the same way he built everything else, on purpose and with care. He was still teaching me, even now. I refolded the letter and held it between both hands. My father hadn't left behind an inheritance. He left behind a way of thinking, a way of loving, a way of protecting what matters without losing yourself in the protecting of it. That was the real legacy, and it was already in motion. Because what he set in motion, what that recovered money would become, is the part of this story that outlasts the courtroom, outlasts the conflict, and outlasts everything Brianna had tried to take. And it starts with a phone call 3 months later, and a number that made me have to set the phone down before I could speak. 3 months after the hearing, Kevin called on a Tuesday morning. The funds identified in the forensic audit, $280,000 transferred out of the company accounts to Lawson Strategic Interiors, had been recovered in full through the investigation process and returned to the Freeman Family Trust, with interest. He read me the total figure. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there. The morning light was coming through the window above the sink. I could hear Nia in the next room asking Jamal something, and Jamal answering her in that older brother tone he uses when he's pretending to be less patient than he actually is. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Everything just slightly brighter than it had been a moment before. When I picked the phone back up, I asked Kevin what the trust guidelines allowed for recovered funds outside of the children's direct disbursements. He walked me through the options. I told him what I wanted to do. He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Your father would have called that practical." I said, "That's the best thing you could have told me." 4 months later, the Quentin Freeman Legacy Scholarship was formally established through a partnership with Georgia Tech's College of Engineering, structured specifically to support Black women pursuing degrees in construction management and civil engineering, first-generation students, single mothers, or both. The first award covered a full academic year, tuition, housing, and materials. My father had never talked about wanting anything named after him. That wasn't who he was. He was the kind of man who fixed what was broken and went quietly back to work. But he had said more than once, over coffee at the kitchen table, over the project board on a Saturday morning with the radio on low, that he'd rarely seen women who looked like me on job sites when he was coming up. And every time he did see one, he watched her work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. He'd say it without bitterness, just as a fact, something that needed correcting. He would have called the scholarship obvious. He would have said it was just filling a gap that shouldn't have been there. The morning I signed the final documents, I drove the green pickup back to the Buckhead house and sat in the driveway for a while, engine off, windows down. The oak out front was pushing new leaves. The porch steps needed paint. The swing moved in a small wind, creaking the same way it had been creaking since I was Nia's age. That small, rhythmic sound my father had always said he'd get around to fixing, and never did. Because some things become part of the house itself, and you stop hearing them as problems. I thought about what he said at the end. We don't just build houses, baby girl. We build futures for the ones coming after us. He meant the trust. He meant the plan. He meant the patience of a man who could see further down the road than anyone around him, and used that distance not to protect himself, but to protect us. But he also meant something simpler and closer than all of that. He meant Jamal at the kitchen table, asking how to think far enough ahead. He meant Nia with her dimples, asking if Grandpa knew they'd be okay. He meant scrambled eggs made right, and a loud old truck that smelled like him, and a letter in a sealed envelope, and a scholarship for a woman who doesn't know yet that someone built something for her before she ever arrived. He meant all of it, every last piece of it. A few weeks after the scholarship announcement, a woman called the office, 31 years old, single mother of 2, 6 years in commercial construction, 1 semester left toward her civil engineering degree, and completely out of ways to pay for it. She was the first recipient. I don't know if she knows the full story of where the money came from, what it took to recover it, what it cost. I hope someday she does. I hope she understands that the man whose name is on that scholarship never met her and loved her anyway, the way you love something you can already see coming, even before it's arrived. What I keep returning to, looking at the whole arc of it from that March morning to now, is something simple. My father never stopped building, not when he was sick, not when he was afraid, not when he saw exactly what Brianna was doing and chose to answer it quietly, on his own timeline, in the only language he'd ever fully trusted, the language of structures built with patience and designed to last. He kept building. That is what love looks like when it's wise enough to think past itself. It doesn't announce, it doesn't demand, it prepares. And then it waits for the right moment to stand. Jamal looked up from his homework one evening, not quite meeting my eyes, the way he does when he's thinking about something bigger than the question he's about to ask. Mom, Grandpa built houses, right? I was at the sink. I turned off the water, dried my hands. Took a moment before I answered because some answers deserve a moment. No, I said. He built futures. Jamal held that, the way he holds things that matter, quietly, completely, turning them over without rushing. Then he went back to his work. Nia was on the couch, braids loose, half watching something on the tablet, half listening the way she always is. She smiled to herself, just slightly, just enough to show the dimples. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. This story teaches us that the most powerful thing a parent can leave behind isn't money, isn't property, and isn't even a name. It's a plan, built on honesty, built on patience, built on the kind of love that thinks past itself and into the future. It teaches us that family isn't what you inherit without thought. It's what you choose to protect, with your mind and your whole heart, even when the cost is high. It teaches us that a woman who has been underestimated, pushed to the edges of her own story, has every right to stand at the center of it. Not with noise, not with bitterness, but with the steady, unshakable calm of someone who knows exactly who she is and exactly what she is fighting for. And it teaches us that the truth doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it's sealed in an envelope, sometimes it's filed in a trust document, sometimes it's held for months by a 12-year-old boy who didn't fully understand what he was carrying, but knew enough to hold on. But when it finally speaks, in a courtroom, in a letter, in a scholarship, in a question asked quietly over homework at the kitchen table, it says everything that needed to be said. Quentin Freeman built houses for 31 years across the city of Atlanta, but what he really built was this, and it will stand.